Hey everyone, this video is going to go over how we can take our quantitative data and turn it into a histogram using Google Sheets. So while we're working through this, keep in mind there is some work you have to do. The computer can't just do it all, so that we get a good visualization of what we should have. Now, I'm looking here at some data that has all of the average working hours per worker over an entire year for various countries around the world. This data came from 2017. And so it's quantitative because it's sort of a continuum. And that's a good sense that I need a histogram, not just a bar graph, because I'm not like putting them into like various groups. It's sort of like there's a number line there on the horizontal axis. So the important thing we want to think about when doing this is what we want to then take that number line and all those various individual values and actually sort of group them together. Because just to give you a sense, if I were to take this data and just throw it into a bar graph, look at all those lines. That doesn't mean anything. There's way too many lines to sort of process what on earth is going on or trends in this data, because it's not really telling to just each country gets its own line. So we don't want a bar graph like that. We want a histogram instead. But to do a histogram, we need to know how many sort of groups do we want to split our data into. So to do that, you need to sort of figure out the range of your data, and then based on how many sort of buckets or bins you want, sort of the bars, how wide each bucket needs to be. So there's a few different ways in Google Sheets we can figure out the range. One way is that we can just figure out the low value and the high value, and we can do that with a formula. So if I want to calculate the min, I'm going to label this min, I can do the oops, I'm deleting my own words. Okay, so min value. Okay, the min value, we can find that by using a formula. So we type equals, and then if we type min, that says we're looking for a minimum value. And then we're going to put parentheses, or if it's going to let me, we're going to put parentheses. And then we're going to highlight the column we want to find the minimum value of. So I'm going to close those parentheses and hit enter. All right, so it's telling me the lowest value on this sort of range of data is 1,354. The next thing I want to figure out is the max value. And so I can do something similar. I'm going to hit equals, and then I'm going to type max, and then I want to put in my entire B column. And there I get my max value. So that's one option. Another option is you can actually sort the data. So if you sort a sheet A to Z, basically what it does is it takes the lowest value and puts it on top, and the highest value and puts it down below. So that's another option. Personally, I like the sort of, actually using our formulas, but it's sort of whatever works for you. Especially if it's a spreadsheet with other data on it, I might not want to, mess with those columns in the order they're written in. All right, so we have our min and we have our max. So then if I want the range, a range of the data is really just the low value, or the high value, I should say, minus the low value. So in this particular case, especially with histograms, I might round the values a little. I want a little bit above and I want a little bit below. So with the minimum, I'm probably going to treat that instead of 1,354, I might treat it as just 1,300. And instead of 2,456, I might just treat it as 2,500. And so again, I can actually do some calculations in my spreadsheet. I don't need to go grab a calculator. And okay, I have 1,200 sort of as my range, my window I'm looking for. All right, now, let's say I want, and we're going to do a few different versions. So let's say I want 10 bins. If I want 10 bins / buckets, then I would take that 1,200 and I would divide it by 10. And that's going to tell me how wide each bucket needs to be. And so I need each bucket's width to be 120. Now let's say I had wanted 20 buckets instead, 20 bins. So if I want 20 bins instead, then I would take that range, and now I would divide it by 20. Oops. So I don't need, my bins don't need to be quite so wide. So it's sort of like you got to look and you got to think like, okay, well, how many am I being asked for? What's a good number? And we're going to, you know, when we do the graph, we're going to take a look at it, because what you'll find is depending on how wide you make the bins, the shape of the data looks very different. And as we'll see in coming weeks, that matters a lot. All right, so let's make our chart. So we're going to highlight the number column. That's the only column we need. And we're going to go back to the bar, the chart, but we don't want a column chart. We want a histogram. And so if you scroll down, underneath other charts is known as a histogram chart. And what you're going to find is that it creates however many bins it thinks you need for the data. And so this one created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bins. But we want to actually sort of set that a little, and then we're going to sort of change some of our labels because our axis labels aren't correct. So we're going to go in here under, not chart style, histogram, and you'll notice right here it says bucket size. Now we're not going to worry about outlier percentile. That would allow you to sort of throw out outliers and ignore them in your data set. We don't need to worry about that, but instead we want to change our bucket size. Now let's start with 10 buckets. So if I want 10 buckets, I need each bucket to be 120 hours wide. So oops, that should have changed to 120. And so notice now I have more buckets, but I also want to change what my horizontal axis is counting by. So I'm going to make the minimum value we talked about, that 1300, and I'm going to make the maximum value we talked about. So I've sort of rearranged my values. I'm also going to change some of my labels. So chart and axis title, I'm great. I'm going to maybe change this to worldwide average working hours per worker. Take out some of that because, you know, it has a little extra. I don't need all of that details in my title. But then I also want to change my horizontal axis title, because those values along the horizontal axis, they are our average working hours per worker over a year. And so this is an hour measure. And my vertical axis is not that. It's actually a frequency. It's how many countries had that average. And so why I like looking initially at this bin setup is notice we have a gap here. So like between this range, this value and this value, there weren't any countries. So we got some sort of high values is sort of what that shows up as. But what's interesting is if we sort of change things around, and I'm just going to duplicate my graph. Let's make a second chart and we're going to edit it. But this time, let's change the bin size to 60. You'll notice, ooh, you know, that sort of got split off. It still sort of separates them a little. But what if we made our bin size like 200? You know, now all of a sudden the data looks much more grouped together. So notice how in changing the number of bins or buckets I have really changes what the graph looks like and whether or not I think I might have sort of super high or super low values. You know, the fewer bins I have, it sort of becomes obvious like, ooh, yeah, there are some extreme high values that seem apart from the rest of the data. It's not symmetrical. It's not a mirror image of each other. And that's going to be really important in the coming weeks as we start to talk about how do we analyze this data. Now, keep in mind, you might be going, well, obviously then I want as small a bucket as possible, but if you make a bucket size of, I don't know, even 10 here, what does that tell me? The data is so spread out and all over the place, it doesn't really give me some general trends of the data, which is why sort of, you know, I like usually somewhere between 10, you know, maybe 6 to 10, you know, depending on how many data points I have. In this case, I think the 10 buckets is good. I think you can also do, that's not where I wanted to put the 60. I think you can also do the 20 buckets and get a good picture. but it sort of gives you a better sense of sort of what's going on with this data. It's a sort of nice picture. And sometimes, like if you're not given it, you really do need to play around to sort of figure out what's going to look good. And hopefully this gives you a sense of how we created our histogram using Google Sheets. Notice that, yes, we did have to figure out our bin width before we went into the computer. And that bin width is really important with how our sort of end data picture ends up looking.